I want to begin with two propositions. First, in my view, the state of the economy and thinking about it is characterized far more by continuity rather than by change. And therefore, one could think of the past 2 years and the past 10 years. The differences are not significant. Second, if we speak about distress, it is important to ask distress for whom? There is prosperity for a few, but there is distress in rural India. There is distress for the poor everywhere. Now, having started with these propositions, I want to say that there is not just a mismatch, but there is a near dichotomy between the economic objectives of this government and its predecessor governments and the economic priorities of the people. Governments have been concerned with economic growth, economic efficiency, fiscal balances, ease of doing business, and so on. The economic priorities of the people are much more about food, clothing, and shelter for their families, employment for at least one member in a household, schools for their children, and healthcare for their families. And in a sense, it is almost as if there's this twain never meets, the concerns of the government and the priorities of the people. Now, before I move to the question that Prabhat and Atul have addressed about 2 years of the Modi government, I want to say that, Naipaul once described India as a land of a million mutinies. I think India is a land of a million crises for people on different days of their daily lives. And I see that there are two sets of crises that confront us as an economy. The first are mounting crises that are visible but not audible. And the second are quiet, almost silent crises that have gone unnoticed. Now, there are three mounting crises that are visible but don't have a voice. The first is jobless growth. In the past 35 years, the Republic of India has witnessed rates of economic growth in the aggregate for GDP, and indeed for the arithmetic mean GDP per capita, that apart from the People's Republic of China are almost the highest in human history. Okay? Yet, this growth has been jobless. Between 2004-5 and 2011-12, for every 10% increase in output, employment went up by less than half of 1%. So the employment elasticities of output have been falling steadily. There is jobless growth. Second, there is rising inequality. It does not show up yet in our numbers on consumer expenditure because they underestimate the consumption of the rich. They don't include savings. They don't measure economic inequality in any way. But inequality has been rising rapidly in the past 30 years. And recent estimates by Tony Atkinson suggest that the Gini coefficient in India, which has a value of 1, if one person has all the income in an economy, and a value of 0 if everybody has an equal income, that was in the range of 0.3, 0.35 for a long time. It now exceeds 0.5. We are not very much behind China or even Brazil in inequality. And it is no surprise that despite this rapid economic growth, poverty persists. And that's our third mounting crisis. There may have been some reduction in absolute poverty if you look at doctored poverty lines. But even if you look at World Bank estimates, which I don't think are very robust, and you look at the difference in the estimates between $1.25 and $2 per day, the number is enormous. In 1980, most of the world's poor lived in India and China. 2/3 were in China, 1/3 in India. In 2012, most of the world's poor still live in China and India, but now almost 3/4 of them are in India. So that if you look at the number of people between the poverty line, say Arjun Sen Gupta's of 12 rupees per capita per day or 20 rupees per capita per day at 2004-5 prices, something that those proportions were 30 and 70% respectively. So 40% of our people are vulnerable to a bad harvest, to illness in the family, to a wedding in the family. So these mounting crises are visible but not audible. Jobless growth, rising inequality, and persistent poverty. But there are at the same time some quiet, almost silent crises. The one in agriculture is quiet, it's less silent, and farmer suicides are symptoms of a much deeper malaise. Something like 2/3 of our people depend upon agriculture directly or indirectly for a livelihood. Agriculture contributes less than 1/6 of our national output. So that GDP per capita in the agricultural sector is less than 1/10 of what it is in the non-agricultural sector. And that has been so for the past 15 years. Infrastructure is not just inadequate, it's at the point of collapse. Amongst the poorest in Asia, and we were meant to be a more industrialized, more developed economy, the spread of education in society. And this government, by the way, I should have said at the outset, what is different about this government is it combines this neoliberal economics with a regressive social and political attitude, which is doubly dangerous because they tend to reinforce each other. But the third quiet crisis is in education. We are perhaps the worst in Asia today. If you look at 1950, we were way ahead of everybody in literacy, in spread of education in society. We are amongst the worst, and this government is compounding the problem, not simply in terms of educational opportunities or the quality of education, but it is being very disruptive of what education is and should be. And last, there is a crisis of deindustrialization in manufacturing. In 1990, 18% of our national income came from manufacturing, and it deployed 16% of our workforce. In 2010, that proportion, or 2012, that proportion, share in output fell to something like 13.5%, and employment to 11%. Indonesia in 1990 was 10% of output and employment. Today, Indonesia in 2012, 2014 is 30% of output and 28% of employment. We are deindustrializing, as Latin America did through the lost decades of the 1980s and 1990s. Now, let me simply say that this government does not seem to recognize either sets of crises, what I described as the mounting crisis or what I described as the silent crisis. It has had the benefit of a collapse in international oil prices that have moderated inflation and eased political pressures on the government. But that also represents a window of opportunities missed, because that collapse or softening of commodity prices, we are the one country that imports commodities. Most countries export commodities. We could have used it to actually drop interest rates sharply, use the exchange rate more aggressively to revive investment, to revive demand, to revive employment. None of that has been done because we are still caught in the fetishism of balanced budgets and price stability. Now, my own sense of this government is that it does not have a big picture of the economy. It does not think about the economy as an integrated whole with interdependence between sectors and between time horizons. B, that is thinking of the economy is characterized very much by a short-termism. The next year, the next election, but not what happens 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And really the state we are in, we need to be thinking long-term, because what we do here and now in agriculture, in infrastructure, in education, in manufacturing, will begin to shape our future 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. In sum, I think this government's thinking on the economy is characterized much more by words than by substance. They are deft words, they are public communications, public relations words, but they have very little substance, as this is something we might wish to go into in the discussion, because we need to recognize that this government, most of you would have seen the newspapers this morning, where both the BJP and independent citizens have written about 2 years of the Modi government. And increasingly, I notice a turn in that attitude of that reporting. Now, there are new kinds of populism that are being introduced, and I don't think we should ignore them. I don't believe they are substantive, but they are there. The Jan Dhan Yojana, which is spoken of as financial inclusion, it has created some resonance if you talk to people. B, the crop insurance scheme, which is meant to be, or tailored as, or sold as, being more comprehensive than the previous crop insurance scheme that was introduced by UPA 2. Or the whole idea, Atul mentioned this, of Skill India or Stand Up India. I find all these phrases very amusing. I don't know what they mean. But nevertheless, there is a new populism that goes with it, that you advance loans from the Mudra Bank or the Skill India Bank to people to employ themselves. All right? So in a sense, it represents a plea that the process of economic growth is not going to create employment opportunities or social opportunities for people at large, and therefore we create another kind of transfer payment, not in the form of wages that came in the NREGA, but in the form of startup funds for people to be self-employed. Now my sense is that there is little that the Modi government has to show for its 2 years in office on the economy in terms of substance. It has much rhetoric, lots of words, but in substance, little has changed and little has been done. Okay? So the crisis we have all talked about persists and run deeper. And it's not just the cost of what we do, it's the cost of what we do not do, the cost of inaction. Because if we do not act on agriculture, on manufacturing, on infrastructure, on education, here and now, we are going to be in a much worse state 10 years from now. And I sense that little has, in that sense, changed. It's been much more a holding operation on the economy and much more an aggressive posture on polity and society. Yet, the economy interacts with and is interdependent with these political and social processes that are simultaneously ongoing. So I would urge us to think a little bit beyond the economy, to focus much more not on the aggregate of the economy, but on the segments of our population or the portions of our country that are altogether excluded. I see Harsh has produced an India exclusion report, because there is an exclusion of regions and of people from this process. Please remember that if an economy grows at 7% per annum for 10 years, GDP doubles. If an economy grows if a GDP per capita grows at 5% per annum for 10 years, it doubles in 14 years. But these are aggregates and arithmetic means. They don't shape the well-being of people. But for 35 years, we have had numbers that look very robust in this sense, but they have not benefited. The distribution of the benefits from this process have been very, very unequal between regions and between people. And I see no evidence of any correctives, and these crises are going to get worse. Let me stop here.